My daughter came home and she was like, boys are more leaderly. She had already, at 5, perceived that dynamic somehow. She couldn't explain it, but she had said enough to the point where I had to ask why she think that and tell her anyone can lead.
Gender inequity, especially in the workplace, has been a prevalent issue in society for centuries. The impacts of the cult of domesticity mindset, established in the early 18th century, emphasizing the roles of women as frail domestic help, is still apparent in the modern workplace. Despite efforts towards equality that continue today, the work industry remains an institution favoring men. An anonymous female employee at a multi-billion-dollar tech company explained,
So when my male colleagues would go in there and drive change, people would say, he's really taking charge. When I would go into situations and do the same, it would come back to me as quite aggressive.
the movement for women's rights can be traced back to the early segregation of women in society, where they were confined by domestic expectations. As the United States moved into an age of Reformation with the Second Great Awakening, a series of religious revivals, the oppression facing women was finally recognized. During the Market Revolution, white women staffed many of the industrial factories, whereas women of color were enslaved on plantations. Lucy Lackrom, a factory worker at the Lowell Mills, argues that the members of a republic like ours owe it to one another that every kind of useful labor shall be held respectable, and also that the moral surroundings of the laborer shall be so looked after, highlighting the ambition women have held for centuries for an equal workplace. As this movement shifted into the progressive era, women were able to secure voting rights with the 19th Amendment, though women of color were excluded due to segregation laws. The second wave of feminism from the 1960s to the 1980s broadened the spectrum of equality, especially for women of color, and brought them further into the workplace. Many of these advancements made from the 18th to 20th centuries, however, deliberately excluded women of color, thus benefiting mainly middle-class white women. Laura Kim, a member of the San Jose Women's Club, has some insight into the causes of this inequity.
I think there are multiple factors that contribute to gender inequality, and the ones that I'm most acutely aware of are cultural expectations and economic dependence.
Today, the push for gender equality continues, particularly through women's representation in the government. From 1971 to 2020, the number of women in the House of Representatives jumped from 13 to over 100 members, and the female representation in the Senate rose from 1 to over 25. Also in 2020, Kamala Harris became the first ever female, Black, and South Asian vice president-elect. The rise of the gender equality movement stems from the women's empowerment movement and people's willingness to discuss salary gaps or cases of sexism in the workplace. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a member of the Supreme Court, remarked that as women achieve power, the barriers will fall. As society sees what women can do, as women see what women can do, there will be more women out there doing things, and we'll all be better off for it.
I think more people are just tired of waiting for their opportunities, so they're creating their own.
Despite this, gender inequalities in the workplace are still prevalent, evident even prior to job holdings, with women being 30% less likely to be given an interview compared to men on equal status.
There really is an advantage to being a preferred gender, depending on who's looking at your application, who's hiring, and what industry it is.
On average, women are paid only 80% of a man's wage in most occupations, and for people of color, these deficits are increased, with Latinas receiving 55 cents to a man's dollar. As of December 2020, women hold 50.4% of jobs in America, yet continue to have smaller wages across the board.
But once people start talking about how much they make and finding out the huge disparity in salaries for like the same work, I think that was a big vehicle in opening eyes.
In order to fix this issue, we can take steps to close the gender imbalances in the workplace today. Joining organizations like the San Jose Women's Club can help uplift and encourage women in our communities to take an active stance on the issue.
I would add that it's really important to build your support network and reaching out to people as possible mentors if you see any that you're interested in, because rejection is really not that awful.
Addressing cases of gender inequity you hear and creating mentorship programs in your office and school can encourage women of all ages to rise above the gender stereotypes. Voting to include legislation that furthers women's rights and understanding that your value lies in your personal attributes, not your gender, can help women stand up to unjust gender classifications. Arbitrary gender stereotypes that have been prevalent for centuries are still present in the modern workplace. Only if we take action to rise above these biases can we evolve into an equal and just society.